So, today's story starts out a little scary and a little bit sad, but it's going to end good, all right? So just hang on. And here's what I'd like you to do. 3 things. You ready? There's going to be a special word today. You're going to see it up here, and it's going to look different than all the other words. So see if you can figure out which one it is. And here's what I'd like you to do. What's the word? How many times do you see it? And tell me one thing that you learn about it. I'm going to say a lot of things about it, but you tell me one thing. And come see me afterwards, and we'll talk about it. All right. Now, for the grown-ups, the children who are big on the outside, here's what I want you to do. We're going to do a thought exercise, and what I want you to think about is a vivid episode from your childhood. Now, this could be a happy one, it could be a sad one, it could be good, it could be bad. All I want it to be is a vivid memory. And it might even be a story. Like, you don't exactly remember it, but it's one of those iconic stories that your family always tells every time you get together. And the very first one that came to mind while I was saying all that, that's the one I want you to think about. A lot of times, the memories that we really should be thinking about are the ones we don't want to, so they disappear. So we got to grab them as soon as they come to mind. So hang on to that one. And what I want you to do now, with this story or this memory in mind, is I want you to attach a feeling to it. Just one. What's the feeling that goes with that story? Just sit with that for a minute. Now I want you to think about your life story from that time to today, and how often that feeling might have popped up, and how that might have affected how you see the world. Because what's true, what we know is true, is that the stories of our growing up shape us. What we experience growing up shapes us. It shapes how we interpret what we experience in life. It shapes how we learn how to cope with life. It shapes our interpretation of events and even how we see people, even how we see ourselves. And that's important to think about, because Steve brought us up to speed last week. We sort of went through 400 years, right? From the end of Genesis to the beginning of Exodus. And we find out that when Joseph was prime minister, these people, his family, were sort of honored guests. They were specially invited with presents to come live in Egypt. But now they're oppressed and they're enslaved. And by the end of chapter 1, matters had gotten really grim for these people. And in today's story, you're going to see an irony. Because Pharaoh, he didn't really realize this, but he had begun a battle of wills with God himself. And at the beginning of our story, Pharaoh had left his people and the Hebrew people with an edict to throw all these baby boys into the Nile. And God said, all right, so be it. From the Nile, your daughter, Pharaoh, will bring into your home and feed at your table and raise at your knee the Hebrew redeemer of the people you oppress. And Pharaoh said, make the people work. Make them work hard. And God said, so be it. You shall pay wages to the mother of this baby, and ultimately this people will plunder your nation of its treasure. Isn't that a great irony? All right, so we're going to go into today's outline. We're going to cover the first couple of verses. We're only going to do 10 verses, but the first couple talk about Moses being hidden. Then the next couple talk about Moses being found. And finally, the last bit is about Moses being adopted. And what we're going to learn is that circumstances do not thwart God's purposes. Isn't that amazing how the songs that we sang this morning sort of underscored that idea? So let's just do a really quick prayer and jump in. Lord God, I just love your word. We all love your words, and we love you, and we love your Holy Spirit who fills us with your mind. How great it is that the author of this book is here to tell us what it means. And so we ask that you'd help us understand. Help us see what you have for us this morning. We pray to the praise of your glorious grace. Amen. So life was bitter for the Hebrew people. They were treated harshly. They were treated cruelly. And yet the Egyptians dreaded this enslaved people. Only the sympathetic housewives stood between these Hebrew baby boys and death itself. And now came Pharaoh's edict to all Egyptians, throw the Hebrew baby boys into the Nile, into the sacred Nile. We'll get back to that later. It was a risky time. It was actually an awful time to bring a baby boy into the world. So let's read the first two verses. Now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. Now most of the Hebrew people, by this time, as we're going to see in the next few chapters, followed the culture of their day, which was in Egypt, and they worshipped other gods. They worshipped the gods of Egypt. They had idols. But there must have been some who worshipped God and had continued to remember who God was, and maybe even had Joseph's journals with them. Because how else do we know what happened before this time? And Amram and Jochebed, they were among that remnant of people because they had a strong faith in God, as we're going to find out. Because here's what the book of Hebrews says. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful. And they were not afraid of the king's edict, which I think is kind of a startling statement from an enslaved person, right? So what did they have faith in? It says by faith. What did they have faith in? What is faith? What do you mean when you say that you have faith, especially if you have faith in God? And the Bible talks about faith all throughout the Old and New Testament. But the only definition that we have for faith is only one, and it's one sentence, and it's in the book of Hebrews. Here's what it says. Faith is the assurance of the things we hope for, the proof of things we do not see, and the conviction of their reality. We know this isn't blind faith. We know that this is a reasonable belief in God's revelation. His revelation through nature, through the cosmos. I mean, we got that from Psalm I did, 19. his revelation through the cosmos, through nature, through the Bible, his written word, and through the revelation of himself in his people and working among people. And faith allows us to see events and circumstances in their proper perspective. We can have a whole bunch of perspectives. But faith gives us the right perspective. And faith also gives us an added resource. It gives us wisdom, and it gives us power. Now, faith has 3 basic components. The first one is the content. It's what we believe. The second basic component is consent. And that means being convinced of and convicted by what we say we believe. The last one is commitment. It means living it out. Actually living out what we believe. So we're asking ourselves, what's the content of Jochebed and Amram's belief or faith? Well, number one, they were not afraid of the king's edict, which is just amazing because his edict was horrible and it was backed up by an entire army. God continued to bless his people, though, and they saw that. He continued to give his people abundant health and strength and children. The next thing is that they saw that Moses was not an ordinary child, because the word beautiful in this passage actually means more than pretty. It means they could see, even as an infant, he had the makings of good character. I don't know how they saw that. I saw that in all 3 of my children, and so they saw that in Moses. All right. They knew that God was against evil and for good. And they looked to God to be their deliverer. And the only way I can figure that out is that they must have somehow known about God's promise to Abraham. That he was going to be Abraham's shield and reward. He was going to make him a great nation. He was going to bless the people who blessed him. He was going to curse the people who cursed him. And he was going to deliver Abraham's descendants from oppression. And if they had that somewhere, that writing somewhere, they would have known. It's been about 400 years. They knew that if they did right in God's eyes, they could trust him. And they could trust him with their son, no matter what happened next. So let's read what happened next. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. And his sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Now, as a mom, I had to ask myself, how in the world could Jochebed bring herself to do this? these are her precious children. How could she bring herself to do this? But both mother and father had consented to God's plan to give up their baby. And so they were sure about him. They were sure that this was what they needed to do, and they had to trust what was going to happen next. So here's a truth that we can get out of this. Faith is belief in God and acting on that belief. Faith is belief in God and acting on that belief. So faith goes beyond believing in God. Faith is trusting God with our very lives, being filled with God's living presence and living for God. So living faith gives God the opportunity to do what he's going to do, to work in us and through us. And so Jochebed and Amram, they translated their heart's consent to God's wisdom to a commitment to follow through and actually do this unusual plan. So when we talk about faith, we talk about, gosh, I wish I had a lot of faith. Faith is actually doing. Faith is the final product of faith is the doing part. It's the living it out. So we don't really have faith until we do the thing. If we waited until we had great faith, we would never have it. Does that make sense? We would never have it if we waited for it before we did anything. Having great faith comes in actually taking that risk, believing that God's going to do right, whatever it is, and then just jumping. Faith grows strong by using it again and again, by admitting that we're out of resources, we're powerless in this situation, we're scared, we're not adequate, but we're going to do whatever it is that God showed us, and we're going to trust him for the rest, whatever happens next. And by a continuing conscious awareness that God really is good. He's good enough. He loves us enough. He's powerful enough. He's interested enough. And he's enough in control that he's going to make sure what's right happens eventually. There are often horrible things that can happen along the way. And especially for Jochebed and Amram, they knew the risks. We also can know that God has already made us able to do whatever it is he's asked of us. Somehow, some way, God has made us able. And everybody in this room knows at least one time when God has asked something of you and you thought to yourself, I can't do it. I just can't do it. I cannot survive this. And yet, you trusted God anyway. And here you are. That's how faith grows. It isn't faith until you do it. So, a truth we get out of that is that you do all you can do, then you trust God with the outcome. You're not in control of it anyway. All you can do is what God's given you to do. And then you let go. He's going to do whatever it is he's going to do next. So I had to ask myself, what situation is worrying me right now? Actually, while I was writing this, what was worrying me was getting my Greek homework in on time, which, by the way, happened. So faith, we know we can have faith because we know we can worry. If we can worry, we can have faith because it takes a lot of energy. Have you noticed that? Don't you get worn out being anxious? That takes a lot of energy to worry. So we can also have faith because we're thinking about it. We just switch our perspective. It doesn't mean doing nothing. Faith doesn't mean doing nothing. It means doing what God's given you to do and then putting your hope in him, your trust in him. There's a nuance there because faith isn't about doing good deeds or racking up righteous points or like being super-de-duper good and stuff like that. Faith is really a matter of trust. But when you trust something, you do it. Like I trust this chair will hold me when I sit down, so I sit on it. See, it's just that. That's what faith is. I want you to think about Jochebed now. Giving up her baby after 3 months to the river Nile. She didn't just give up her baby. She gave up her little right-hand girl, too. And that was what her faith was asking of her. What's what God was asking of her. Not just one child, but 2 children. God didn't show Jochebed what was going to happen next. He didn't show her how it was going to end. He only showed her the next thing to do. And I want you to think about how hard it was for her to wait. Talk about worry, right? Talk about anxious. She and Amram had no idea what was going to happen. And if I had been her, I would have had to fight the impulse every second to run back there, grab my children, and say, this is ridiculous. What a ridiculous plan. We're not doing this. But she didn't do that. She fully expected that God, whatever God was going to do, it was going to be right. They believed in his power. And they believed in his ability to protect, but they also believed he loved them no matter what would happen next. Because it could have ended differently, right? Miriam was probably, we're going to go into the next chunk, which is Moses is found. Miriam was probably around 8 or 9 years old. So all of us have known a third grader in our life at some point, right? Imagine how it must have been for Miriam. Her family was an enslaved people, and her parents were God-fearing, but they were living in poverty. They had no rights. They had no protection. As a member of the slave class, Miriam probably had to work very hard most of her little life already. She probably helped her father and her mother. I get the idea she was the oldest. And she probably had to help with the kids. Well, there was Aaron anyway, and the baby, and the household, and so on. And just think about the external facts of her story. Not very much food, harsh treatment from the Egyptian people, long, hard days of labor. She's just a little girl. How do you think her life shaped her? And then in a desperate attempt to save her baby Moses' life, Jochebed left her little third grader to watch a floating basket among the reeds of a crocodile-infested river. Wow. Jochebed was an enslaved woman. She had to go to work. She had no choice. Amram was an enslaved man. He had no choice. They had to go. And we know how resourceful and courageous little Miriam was. In fact, she set the trajectory of Moses' life, when you think about it, as well as her life, with her quick thinking and her winning ways with this Egyptian princess. I was a little brownie came to my door yesterday to sell cookies. And she was so cute. She was terrified of me. So she was like, and so I tried to help her. Are you selling cookies? She was terrified. But think of a little third grader running up to a princess. She's an enslaved girl. She knows who she is. Running up to a princess. Very resourceful, quick thinking, winning way. But how was it for her knowing that Mama had left her in danger too? All alone to watch the baby. Now we'll have to use our imagination to try to discern Miriam's internal story. On the outside, we see this resourceful, courageous little girl. But what about the inside? Think about the trauma of slavery. Think about the trauma of her life being at risk. And these are questions that are worth thinking about as we get deeper into the story of Miriam and the Exodus. So just tuck that away for later. She had found a way to cope with the pain of slavery. She had to. And the pain of mistreatment and not really having a childhood and having to grow up very fast. And she learned how to do all things well. And she learned how to be large and in charge, even for a little girl, how to perform well, how to do her duty. But I wonder how loved Miriam felt in that moment. I wonder what she thought about as she watched that little basket in the river, afraid that a crocodile might hurt her, or even worse, hurt the baby. Because how could she go home then to face her parents after they'd put her in charge of the baby? I wonder if she made an early vow that she was never going to be vulnerable. She was always going to be strong, and nobody was going to get the better of her. I wonder, and this is because I know her story, I wonder if in those moments, or even in those first 3 months, a deep down jealousy began to grow, and envy about this baby who seemed to be the most loved and the best cared for. We do know that slavery had not broken this little girl. It shaped her character to be strong and hardy and to be brave and not to fear pain or suffering or hardship. She knew what it was to make life and death decisions even as a little girl. So this little girl watched her baby brother, and she stayed attuned to everything that was happening, And she found out that waiting on God is always worth it. Because as Miriam watched, the princess of Egypt arrived. So let's read what happens. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. Who is Pharaoh's daughter? I love archaeology. And so, who is Pharaoh's daughter? Now, the Bible does not give a definitive answer, and I'm sure you know theologians have been arguing about who Pharaoh's daughter is for like the last, thousands of years. And I'm just going to say archaeological evidence for the destruction layer in Canaan, and also the timeline of the ancient pharaohs. I think that it could easily have been that Moses was born about 1525 BC. You don't have to write that down. It's just my idea. During the reign of Thutmose I. Because he had a favorite child, and his favorite child was actually a daughter named Hatshepsut, and she's one of the very few women who ever became queen. Actually, they called them kings of Pharaoh. He named his daughter over her brothers as his heir, which I'm sure you know was very happy in the whole household of brothers that their sister was going to be their boss. Eventually, she married a half-brother just to hang on to power, and she did rule Egypt for 22 years. It's a terrific story. The rest of the teaching team may have their own ideas, so just, hold that with open hands. I do. It's just fun to try and figure out where this landed, because it's a true story. It really happened. Whoever she was, she probably was in her late teens when she went down to the river with her attendants, and here's what they were doing. The attendants were walking up and down the river like this, and they're just making noise and so forth. There's snakes and there's crocodiles, and if one of her attendants got bit or dragged into the river, too bad. But if she did, that would be terrible. Okay, so that's what all her attendants are doing. They're just trying to make it safe, and they're all shh like this, and of course, she sees something. Now, why was she going to the Nile if it was so dangerous? Here's the sacred part. The Nile was considered a sacred river. So bathing in it, if you bathed in it, then you would receive health, but even better, you would receive fruit. So the implication is she wanted a baby. So she was going to bathe in the Nile, and the god of the Nile would grant her fruit. All right, and what happens? Okay, next couple verses. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. Of course, not her, right? The slave. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. This is one of the Hebrew babies, she said. Now, we already know he was a beautiful baby. He was not an ordinary child. He was fine and lovely. And by God's perfect timing, he began to cry. Now, I want you to think about your insides. How many of you have heard a baby cry? All right? Okay, so a study was done on mothers' brains just a number of years ago about what happens to the mother when the baby cries. And their whole brain lights up. It's so interesting. The motivation center lights up. The empathy center lights up. The panic and anxiety center lights up. Everything they've got lights up. And here's what we know. God designed a baby's cry to make us want to take care of the baby. And that's what was happening to Pharaoh's daughter. She saw this beautiful Hebrew baby. She knew he was Hebrew because he had a different skin tone than she did. He had distinctive features of a Hebrew baby. And anyway, why would someone leave their baby floating in the Nile? All right? So she knew. She knew that especially her father, but all Egypt dreaded the Hebrews. She knew they were an enslaved people. She knew they were growing too numerous for comfort. She knew her fathers had said these babies are not allowed to live, the boys. God was presenting Pharaoh's daughter with a moral choice. What would she do? Would she tip the basket and let the little helpless baby fall into the river and walk away? Because that's what many citizens would have done. Pharaoh had exercised his moral choice in the death of countless unwanted babies. It was legal. And even though the citizens of Egypt may not have personally approved of it or liked it, they also didn't stand in the way. They agreed to it. But her heart was now engaged, and she would not allow this little baby to be drowned in the river or fed to crocodiles. And there's a kind of a neat symbolism here. The Nile represented death to the Hebrew people, but death did not have its victory in this sense. God intervened, and he saved the one who would one day intervene on behalf of all Israel. Now, to the Egyptians, the Nile represented life and fruit, and Pharaoh's daughter must have seen this baby as a gift of the god of the Nile, bearing her fruit. Do you see God's providence in this? The little basket didn't drift away or get attacked by meat-eating predators. The basket remained hidden from everyone's view until the princess herself saw it. The princess came at just the right time, to just the right place on the riverbank. As if on cue, the baby begins to cry. And he's such a beautiful baby. The baby melted the heart of the second most powerful person in Egypt. None of these things are coincidences. God was working everything together. These are God incidences. Human choices working together with God's movement through the physical realm and the spiritual realm to bring his purposes to fulfillment. Now, there's a parenthesis here. There were a lot of God-fearing parents who lost their babies. That's true. And their hearts ached. God permitted that. We don't know the end point of their stories. All we can say is we know this story. In this story, God saved a redeemer, and he drew him from the waters. And we'll talk more about what that means. When Jochebed and Amram had faith in God, it wasn't that they considered themselves more special than the others. And I want to believe that they understood the risk. Something bad could definitely have happened. It's just this time it didn't. Didn't make them any better, didn't make them more special or more loved. Nevertheless, even when you do not see it, God is always there, working for the good of his beloved, even through tragic and horrible circumstances. So I want you to look back on your life. Think about the bad things that happened. And they were bad. Some of them were really bad, horrifyingly bad. Maybe you had to work a lot. Maybe you had to do things that you hated. Maybe you've made some moral choices that you deeply regret and which you could have done differently. They're all bad things. But I now want you to picture the Lord with you in every moment. And he's been weaving that together to bring you where you are today. Always intending ultimate good. And in the meantime, equipping you to bring this message of love and comfort and rescue and forgiveness to others, because you've lived through some awful things. And you know that God is good and that he loves you and that he's with you. Well, we're going to talk about Moses being adopted. While Pharaoh's daughter was looking lovingly at this beautiful little boy who was crying and helpless, and her heartstrings were being twanged, and she was full of compassion, just flooded with love for this gift from the God of the Nile, here comes a little girl, a little Hebrew girl. And here's what happens. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" "Yes, go," she answered. Now I want you to notice what Miriam didn't say. She didn't say, "Oh, I know the baby's mother. Shall I go get the mother?" And she didn't say, "Oh, he's my brother. I've been watching. I'm so glad that you picked him up." See, even as a little girl, she must have intuited that mentioning any family might have broken this fragile bond that was beginning to grow between Pharaoh's daughter and this little baby. So whether she had rehearsed it or not, this was brilliant, and in my opinion, an early sign of the wise and powerful prophet she would one day become. Miriam did know where her mother was working. And she must have known because she went and got her, right? And I'm thinking as a mother, there's no way you'd leave your little girl by the crocodile-infested Nile and not tell her where you were, right? So she knew where she was. She brought her mother back to meet the Pharaoh's daughter, and both made sure to act very neutrally. Read these words carefully and see what happens. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." So who took the baby? The woman. The woman took the baby and nursed him. So at least to Pharaoh's daughter, she was very careful not to let on who this baby was to her. But I wonder what was happening on the other side of her calm demeanor. Just think about what she's gone through that day so far. The very thing that she had given over to God, God gave back to her. If she'd had tried to hang on to Moses, she could very well have lost him. In fact, God gave her more than she asked for or even imagined, because not only did he give Moses back to his mother, God provided wages for his care. So their family would lack in nothing now. And God provided royal protection for the whole family, because now they were in the direct employ of Pharaoh's household. Wow! Talk about a reward of faith, right? When God grows your faith in mind, he does it with successive tests of faith. Each test is going to be harder than the test before, because, of course, you aced the last one, so now it's got to be harder. Each time, the test of faith is going to seem like something impossible. I just can't do it. I haven't got it. I can't do it, God. And God's answer is always going to be the same. He's going to say, "Do you trust me now? Do you trust me? Do you trust me?" Jochebed and Amram's faith was going to get tested again. There was going to be one more heart-wrenching act that they were going to have to do. And here it comes. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. First, Jochebed hid her baby. Then she put him in a teeny tiny little ark on the river Nile, hoping he would be saved. Hoping. Now she would have to leave her little baby boy, her precious baby boy, in the hands of strangers and aliens and say goodbye for the last time, forever. Now, children in ancient times were generally weaned between 3 and 5 years old, so that tells you about how old he was. There were going to be a lot of lonely years for her now, wondering about her baby boy, what he would be taught. Would he be loved? Would he be cared for? Would he be mistreated? Would he be teased because he looked different than all the other people in that palace? There must have been hundreds of details that she would have wanted to tell Pharaoh's daughter, but she had to be the woman, right, and not his mother. She, Pharaoh's daughter, named him Moses, saying, "I drew him out of the water." Now, Moses probably did have a name from his parents. Who knows what it is, because that name was set aside forever. Pharaoh's daughter had the privilege of naming him for life. The word Moses comes from the Egyptian word for water, which is mo, and the verb to save out of water, which is usis. And it can also relate to the Egyptian word mes, which means child or son. But the emphasis isn't so much on what she named him. The emphasis is that she claimed the right to name him because she was the one who drew him out of the water. It wasn't her, really. It was the slave, remember? Okay. What's interesting here is that the Hebrew verb masha also means to draw or draw out. And it's only used one other time in the whole Bible. And it's in Psalm 18, where David says, he drew, got that? He drew Moshe, he drew me out of many waters. Pharaoh's daughter was probably not speaking Hebrew, that's my guess, when she named him. So Moses was probably known by his Egyptian name, this name that means draw out or son. But then the Bible says he gave up the wealth of Egypt so he could align himself with God's people. And that's when his name gets translated into Moshe. Now here's what's so cool about this. To the Hebrews, Moshe came to mean he who draws out of the waters. You know which waters they meant? Take a wild guess. Come on, guys. The Red Sea. Moshe drew us out of the Red Sea. That's what that came to mean. Even in his name, God was at work preparing Moses for the man he was going to be, for his purpose in life. And if Jochebed had lived to see Moses come back, I don't think she did because he was like 80, right? But in any case, when he came back, think how her heart would have swelled knowing that all that suffering and sacrifice was worth it. Everything that happened to Moses prepared him to be a leader, even living in Pharaoh's house, because there's no way his parents could have given him what Acts 7 says. Pharaoh's daughter adopted him and brought him up as her own son, and Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was mighty in his words and deeds, which is another thing to hang on to for later. Did you catch that last phrase? He was mighty in his words and deeds? All right, just hang on to that. All of this, God made sure that Moses could have, something his parents could never have given him. And so the last truth we have, God is worthy of our trust. He really is. God was doing something really big. He was saving a whole people group. He was saving an entire nation. He was going to build them up. He was keeping a 400-year-old promise. And so God did what God does. He thought, this is huge. Oh, this is big. So I'm going to start with a baby and a little girl. That'll be how I'm going to do it. You just watch what God's done in your own life. He's done big things with you. And how has he started? With a mighty nation and an enormous army? Or with you quivering in your boots saying, I can't do it. I'm not up to this. That's God. What really big thing might he even be doing right now? Keep in mind, he hasn't written the last chapter yet. You're in the middle. What do you think you could trust him with right now? So let's sing a song and think about that.